I'm about to tell you the most unbelievable story of how my HOA neighbor Karen Stevenson tried to steal my house over a $3 utility bill and how my investigation exposed her. My name is James Martinez, and I'm about to tell you how my HOA neighbor, Karen Stevenson, tried to steal my house over a $3 utility bill and how my investigation exposed her multi-million-dollar real estate fraud empire that sent her to federal prison for 15 years. I was a 67-year-old retired electrician living peacefully in Willowbrook Estates, Arizona. My wife Maria had passed away 8 months earlier after battling cancer, and I was still adjusting to life alone. That Tuesday morning, I found a certified letter that made my blood run cold. Notice of lien and foreclosure proceedings. Your property is subject to immediate foreclosure due to outstanding HOA violations totaling $15,847.33. The breakdown was insane. Outstanding utility assessment, $3. Late fee, $50. Administrative processing fee, $200. Legal filing fee, $500. Daily accumulating penalties, 180 days, $9,000. Collection agency fees, $3,500. Foreclosure preparation costs, $2,594.33. They were trying to foreclose on my house over a $3 utility bill I'd never heard of. I immediately called Karen Stevenson, our new HOA president who had moved in a year ago and quickly positioned herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed dictator. Mr. Martinez, I was wondering when you'd contact us about your outstanding obligations. Karen, this notice says I owe $15,000 for a $3 utility bill. This has to be a mistake. There's no mistake, James. You've been in violation for 6 months, and penalties have accumulated according to our revised fee structure. What $3 utility bill? The special water conservation assessment implemented in March. All residents were notified by email. I never received any email about a water assessment. That's not our problem if you don't maintain current contact information. Your failure to pay triggered our enhanced collection protocols. Karen, you're talking about foreclosing on my house over $3. I'm talking about enforcing community financial obligations that you chose to ignore. Actions have consequences, James. How do I pay $3 and get rid of $15,000 in fake fees? The fees aren't fake. They're legally assessed penalties. However, if you pay the full amount within 30 days, we can avoid additional foreclosure costs. $15,000? Karen, I'm a retired electrician on a fixed income. I don't have that kind of money. That's unfortunate, but financial hardship doesn't negate legal obligations. Perhaps you should have considered your limitations before ignoring assessments. I didn't ignore anything. I never received notice. James, don't raise your voice. I'm trying to help before this becomes more expensive. More expensive than $15,000 for $3? Formal foreclosure adds significant legal costs. We're at pre-foreclosure stage now. You can't foreclose over $3. James, you don't understand modern HOA law. As a board-certified community financial manager, I have extensive training. The next morning, I went to Karen's house. Her front yard had been transformed into an elaborate showcase garden worth tens of thousands. Karen, you're trying to take my house over $3. That's not legal. It's about $15,000 in accumulated penalties now. The original assessment is irrelevant. I gestured at her expensive landscaping. Where did the money for this come from? How dare you? Karen exploded. How dare you accuse me of theft? I've dedicated my life to protecting this community's property values. By threatening to steal people's houses over fake bills? By enforcing obligations that irresponsible residents like you ignore? I've spent months developing enforcement protocols. Karen, I'm 67 and my wife just died. I'm not trying to violate anything. Age and circumstances don't exempt you from responsibilities. Elderly residents often require more aggressive enforcement because they ignore modern community standards. You're targeting elderly residents because we're easier to intimidate? I'm targeting non-compliant residents. If elderly homeowners are overrepresented, that's their failure to adapt to modern governance. You've been here 1 year. 1 year of transforming this community into a professionally governed residential complex. By threatening to steal houses, by enforcing legitimate obligations, If you can't afford to live in a properly managed community, perhaps you should relocate. Are you telling me to move out of my house? I'm telling you that residents who won't meet obligations might be happier elsewhere. We'll see about that. As I walked away, Karen called after me, "James, this doesn't have to be adversarial. Pay your legitimate obligations and this whole situation goes away." I didn't turn around. How could a $3 utility bill turn into foreclosure proceedings? I knew I needed help, so I called my neighbor Tom Wilson, a retired accountant who had always been good with financial matters. "Tom, I need your advice. The HOA is trying to foreclose on my house over a $3 bill." "They're trying to what?" "Jim, that's impossible." I showed Tom the foreclosure notice, and his reaction was immediate and intense. "This is completely fraudulent. You can't foreclose on someone's house over $3 in 6 months. Arizona law requires years of non-payment and proper legal procedures." That's what I thought, but Karen says it's all legal under revised HOA bylaws. "Jim, I've been on HOA boards for 20 years. You can't revise bylaws to allow instant foreclosure over tiny amounts. This document isn't worth the paper it's printed on." Tom helped me research Arizona HOA law, and what we found was clear. Even legitimate HOA liens require substantial amounts owed over extended periods, multiple notices, and court oversight. The minimum amount for an HOA lien in Arizona is $1,200 owed for at least 1 year, Tom explained. And even then, foreclosure requires judicial oversight and homeowner protections. So this whole thing is fake? Not just fake, it's potentially criminal fraud. Someone is trying to steal your house using fabricated legal documents. We decided to dig deeper into Karen's background and her role in the HOA. What we found was disturbing. Karen had somehow gotten herself elected as both HOA president and financial manager, despite having lived in the community for less than a year. She had also convinced the board to grant her emergency financial authority to handle collections and legal matters. But most suspicious was the fact that 3 other houses in our community had received similar foreclosure notices in the past 6 months, all for minor HOA violations that had supposedly accumulated massive penalties. "Jim, I think Karen is running some kind of foreclosure scam," Tom told me after we spent a day researching. "And I think we need to call the police." Before calling the police, Tom and I decided to talk to the other homeowners who had received foreclosure notices. What we discovered was a clear pattern of targeting and fraud. Our first stop was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 82-year-old widow who lived alone on Cactus Street. Eleanor had received a foreclosure notice 3 months earlier for unauthorized landscaping modifications. She had planted roses without HOA approval. "They said I owed $12,000 for planting flowers in my own yard," Eleanor told us, her voice shaking. "I was so scared I might lose my house that I paid them the money from my savings." "You paid $12,000 for planting roses?" Tom asked in disbelief. "Karen said if I didn't pay immediately, the fees would keep growing and I'd lose everything. I couldn't afford to fight it." Eleanor showed us her payment records. She had withdrawn $12,000 from her retirement account and written a check to Willowbrook Estates Legal Fund. Our next visit was to Robert Chen, a 74-year-old retired teacher whose foreclosure notice claimed he owed $18,000 for noise violations related to his air conditioning unit. The unit was installed by the previous owner and had been running for 8 years, Robert explained. Suddenly, Karen decided it was too loud and violated noise ordinances that nobody had ever heard of. "Did you pay the fees?" I asked. "I had to. She said they'd take my house if I didn't. $18,000 from my pension fund." The third victim was Maria Santos, a 69-year-old retired nurse who had been charged $9,500 for improper mailbox positioning. "My mailbox was 6 inches closer to the street than Karen's new. Regulations allowed," Maria explained. 6 inches. And somehow, that turned into almost $10,000 in fees and penalties. All 3 victims had the same story: minor violations that supposedly triggered massive penalties under Karen's revised bylaws, threats of immediate foreclosure, and pressure to pay enormous amounts to avoid losing their homes. Tom and I realized we were looking at a systematic fraud scheme targeting elderly residents with fabricated violations and illegal foreclosure threats. Tom and I spent the next week conducting what amounted to a private investigation into Karen's activities. What we found was even more disturbing than we had imagined. First, we discovered that the Willowbrook Estates legal fund that victims had been paying was actually a bank account controlled entirely by Karen. The account had received over $50,000 in payments from residents over the past 6 months. Second, we found that Karen had been systematically targeting elderly residents who lived alone and might be vulnerable to intimidation tactics. Third, we learned that Karen had been working with a real estate agent named Marcus Webb to identify properties that might be good candidates for foreclosure and resale. But the most shocking discovery came when Tom's daughter, who worked for the County Recorder's Office, helped us research property transfers in our community. "Dad, you're not going to believe this," she told us during a phone call. 3 houses in Willowbrook Estates have been transferred to something called Desert Holdings LLC in the past 4 months. All 3 transfers show foreclosure sale as the reason. Desert Holdings, who owns that company? The registered agent is listed as Karen M. Stevenson. Tom and I stared at each other in disbelief. Karen wasn't just stealing money from elderly residents, she was actually stealing their houses. We convinced Eleanor, Robert, and Maria to meet with us to compare their experiences and plan a response to Karen's fraud scheme. Eleanor's story was heartbreaking. After I paid the $12,000, Karen told me there were additional compliance fees I needed to pay to ensure my landscaping stayed in good standing. She wanted another $3,000. "Did you pay it?" Tom asked. "I was about to, but my son found out what was happening and threatened to call the police. That's when Karen backed off and said the compliance fees could be deferred." Robert's experience was similar. "After I paid $18,000 for the air conditioning violation, Karen said I needed to pay for ongoing noise monitoring to make sure my unit stayed in compliance. Another $5,000. "This woman is running an extortion operation," Tom said angrily. Maria had the most disturbing story. Karen told me that if I couldn't pay the $9,500 immediately, she could arrange a payment plan where I would transfer my house to the HOA temporarily and then buy it back over time. "She wanted you to sign over your house?" I asked. "She had all the paperwork ready. She said it was a common arrangement for elderly residents who had trouble with large payments." We realized that Karen's scheme was escalating from simple fraud to outright theft of people's homes. Armed with evidence of Karen's fraud scheme, Tom and I decided to confront her directly before involving law enforcement. We wanted to give her a chance to return the stolen money and stop the foreclosure proceedings. We found Karen at the community center on Thursday afternoon, where she was holding what she called office hours for HOA business. She had set up an elaborate workspace with multiple filing cabinets, official-looking forms, and what appeared to be a professional legal library. "Karen, we need to talk to you about the foreclosure notices and the money you've been collecting from elderly residents," I said directly. Karen didn't look up from her paperwork. "Mr. Martinez, if you're here to discuss your outstanding obligations, I'm happy to review payment options. However, I should warn you that your balance has increased to $18,347 due to continued accumulation of penalties. I'm here to discuss the fact that you're running a fraud scheme targeting vulnerable seniors." Now she looked up, her expression shifting from bureaucratic indifference to something more dangerous. "That's a very serious accusation, James. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such inflammatory claims." "We have plenty of evidence. We know about the fake violations, the illegal foreclosure threats, and the money you've stolen from Eleanor, Robert, and Maria." Karen stood up slowly, her hand resting on what appeared to be a legal briefcase. "I haven't stolen anything from anyone. I've been enforcing legitimate HOA obligations according to established legal procedures and community governance protocols." Tom stepped forward with a folder of documents. "Karen, we've researched Arizona HOA law extensively. Everything you've been doing is completely illegal. You can't foreclose on someone's house over $3. You can't create fake penalties that accumulate to thousands of dollars overnight. Gentlemen, you're not lawyers, and you clearly don't understand the complexities of modern HOA governance and financial management. Perhaps you should stick to areas where you actually have expertise." "We understand fraud when we see it," I replied, "and we know about Desert Holdings LLC." For the first time, Karen's carefully maintained composure cracked. Her eyes narrowed and her voice took on a sharper edge. "I don't know what you think you know about legitimate business entities, but you're venturing into areas that could have serious legal consequences for you. Legal consequences? You mean like the consequences you've been threatening elderly residents with? I mean the consequences of making false accusations against community leaders who are operating within their legal authority. Defamation and harassment are serious crimes, James. Tom pulled out more documents. Karen, we've documented everything. The fake violations, the illegal foreclosure threats, the money you've collected, the houses you've stolen through fraudulent procedures. Houses I've stolen? Karen's voice exploded to a volume that echoed through the community center. How dare you accuse me of theft? I have spent 18 months cleaning up the financial disaster left by incompetent previous board members. By threatening to foreclose on elderly residents over minor violations, by implementing proper financial controls and enforcement, mechanisms that protect property values and community standards. Do you have any idea what this community was like before I took charge? It was like a normal neighborhood where people didn't get threatened with foreclosure over $3. It was like a financial disaster zone where residents ignored their obligations and previous board members were too weak to enforce compliance. Property values were declining. Community standards were collapsing. Someone had to take decisive action. Karen was now pacing behind her desk, her voice getting louder and more shrill. I have dedicated my life to protecting this community. I've worked 18-hour days developing enforcement protocols. I've invested my own money in legal research and professional training. Instead of gratitude, I'm being attacked by residents who can't handle effective governance. Effective governance doesn't involve stealing money from cancer widows, Tom shot back. I haven't stolen anything, Karen screamed, slamming her hand on her desk so hard that papers scattered. I have collected legitimate fees and penalties according to legally established procedures. Procedures you made up yourself. Procedures I developed through extensive research and professional consultation. Just because you don't understand modern community management doesn't make it illegal. I stepped closer to her desk. Karen, Eleanor Patterson paid you $12,000 for planting roses in her yard. Robert Chen paid $18,000 for an air conditioning unit that had been there for 8 years. How is that legitimate? Those residents violated community standards and failed to obtain proper authorization for their modifications. The fees they paid reflect the true cost of compliance monitoring and enforcement. Compliance monitoring? You threatened to take their houses? I enforced consequences that were severe enough to ensure future compliance. The previous board's lenient approach created a culture of violations that was destroying property values. Property values? Your house has $60,000 worth of new landscaping. Where did that money come from? Karen's face turned bright red, and for a moment I thought she might actually attack me physically. My personal property improvements are none of your business. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to maintain exemplary community standards, and my residence serves as a showcase for the neighborhood. A showcase paid for with money stolen from elderly residents. Money collected through legitimate enforcement actions. James, you clearly don't understand the difference between personal financial management and community governance. Tom pulled out more documents. Karen, we have bank records showing that Eleanor's $12,000 payment went directly to your personal landscaping contractor. That's completely coincidental. My landscaping was funded through legitimate personal resources. From where? You haven't had a job since you moved here. My financial situation is private and has nothing to do with HOA governance. I don't have to justify my personal expenses to residents who are delinquent on their community obligations. Delinquent on fake obligations that you made up. Real obligations that you're too ignorant to understand. Karen was now shouting so loudly that other residents were starting to gather outside the community center to see what was happening. Karen, I said as calmly as possible, we're giving you one chance to return the money you've stolen and stop these fake foreclosure proceedings. If you don't, we're going to the police. Go ahead. Call the police. Call the FBI. Call whoever you want. They'll find that I've been operating within my complete legal authority as a duly elected HOA president. We'll see about that. Yes, you will see. You'll see that effective community leadership sometimes requires making difficult decisions that weak people can't handle. You'll see that protecting property values requires enforcing standards that some residents find inconvenient. She was now pointing at us dramatically, her voice reaching a fever pitch. I have transformed this community from a loosely managed neighborhood into a professionally governed residential complex. I have implemented financial controls that protect compliant residents from the irresponsibility of people like you. People like us? You mean people who don't want their houses stolen over $3? People who think community rules don't apply to them. People who ignore their obligations and then cry about the consequences. People who would rather attack effective leadership than take responsibility for their own failures. Tom and I exchanged glances. Karen was completely unhinged, but she was also providing us with a detailed confession of her fraud scheme. Karen, are you admitting that you've been threatening foreclosure over minor violations to collect money from elderly residents? I'm admitting that I've been doing my job as HOA president. I'm admitting that I've been protecting property values and community standards through proper enforcement mechanisms. Even if it means elderly residents lose their life savings? Even if it means residents learn to follow the rules? James, this community has standards, and those standards must be maintained regardless of individual financial circumstances. So you don't care if you bankrupt elderly residents? I care about protecting the investments of compliant residents. If some people can't afford to live in a properly managed community, that's not my problem. At this point, several neighbors had come into the community center to listen to Karen's rant. Mrs. Henderson from Pine Street spoke up. Karen, are you saying that elderly residents should be forced out if they can't pay your fake fees? I'm saying that residents who can't meet their financial obligations should consider whether this community is appropriate for their circumstances. Even residents who've lived here for years, especially residents who've been ignoring their obligations for years. Length of residence doesn't exempt anyone from current standards. The small crowd of neighbors was getting angry as they realized the scope of Karen's targeting of elderly residents. Karen, Mr. Davis called out, you told me I owed $5,000 for having the wrong color mailbox. Are you saying that was legitimate? Your mailbox violated community aesthetic standards. The fee you were assessed reflects the cost of compliance monitoring and enforcement. Compliance monitoring for a mailbox? Compliance monitoring for all community standards violations. Someone has to ensure that residents maintain appropriate property conditions. The neighbors were now talking among themselves, realizing that Karen had been targeting many of them with fake violations. Tom seized the moment. Karen, how many residents have you threatened with foreclosure over minor violations? I don't threaten anyone with anything. I inform residents of the consequences of non-compliance and give them opportunities to resolve their violations. By demanding thousands of dollars in fake penalties, by implementing penalty structures that are severe enough to ensure future compliance. If people don't want to pay penalties, they should follow the rules. Rules that you made up. Rules that I researched and implemented according to best practices in community governance. She was now shouting again, completely out of control. You people have no idea what effective community management requires. You think HOA governance is about organizing potluck dinners and maintaining swimming pools? Modern community management requires financial discipline and enforcement capabilities. It requires stealing from elderly residents. It requires protecting property values from residents who don't understand their obligations. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. Karen, my husband and I are both in our 70s. Are you specifically targeting elderly residents because you think we're easier to intimidate? I'm targeting non-compliant residents regardless of age. If elderly homeowners happen to be overrepresented in that group, that's because they often have difficulty adapting to modern community standards. So you admit you're targeting elderly residents? I admit that elderly residents often require more aggressive enforcement because they tend to ignore regulations and resist change. The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors realized Karen was openly admitting to targeting elderly residents with fake violations and foreclosure threats. This is elder abuse. She's running a scam against senior citizens. How many people has she stolen money from? Karen tried to regain control of the situation by shouting over everyone. I have not abused anyone. I have enforced community standards that protect everyone's property values. If some residents can't handle effective governance, that's their problem. Tom pulled out his phone. Karen, we're calling the police right now. This conversation is over. Go ahead, call them. They'll find that everything I've done is completely legal and within my authority as HOA president. We'll see about that. As Tom dialed 911, Karen gathered her papers and briefcase. This is exactly what's wrong with modern communities. Residents who can't handle strong leadership trying to destroy effective governance. You people deserve the chaos and property value decline that you're about to bring on yourselves. She stormed out of the community center, still shouting about property values and effective governance. The neighbors who had witnessed her meltdown were stunned by what they had heard. She admitted to targeting elderly residents, Mrs. Henderson said in shock. She admitted to making up violations and collecting fake fees, Mr. Davis added. And she admitted to threatening foreclosure over minor violations, Tom concluded. We need to make sure the police hear all of this, I said. The next morning, Tom and I went to the county sheriff's office to file a complaint against Karen for fraud and extortion. Detective Lisa Rodriguez listened to our story with growing concern. Let me make sure I understand this. Your HOA president is threatening to foreclose on people's houses over minor violations and collecting thousands of dollars in fake penalties. That's exactly what's happening. And we think she's actually stealing houses through fraudulent foreclosure procedures. Detective Rodriguez examined all our documentation. The fake foreclosure notices, the payment records, the evidence of Desert Holdings LLC, and the testimonies from the elderly victims. Mr. Martinez, what you're describing is criminal fraud on multiple levels. If these documents are fabricated and she's stealing money under false pretenses, we're looking at felony charges. What happens next? We're going to start a formal investigation. I'll need statements from all the victims, copies of all financial records, and documentation of her role in the HOA. Detective Rodriguez also told us something that made the case even more serious. Fraud schemes targeting elderly residents carry enhanced penalties under Arizona law. If she's specifically choosing victims based on age and vulnerability, that's elder abuse, which is a felony. The investigation moved quickly. Within a week, Detective Rodriguez had gathered enough evidence to obtain a warrant to search Karen's financial records and seize documents from the HOA office. What they found was even more extensive than we had suspected. The search warrant was executed on a Tuesday morning, and I watched from my front yard as investigators spent 4 hours going through Karen's house and the community office. Detective Rodriguez called me that afternoon with shocking news. Mr. Martinez, this is much bigger than we initially thought. Mrs. Stevenson has been running this scheme for over a year, and she's victimized dozens of elderly residents across multiple communities. Multiple communities? She's been operating similar fraud schemes in 3 other retirement communities in Arizona. The total amount of money involved appears to be over $400,000. $400,000? And she's actually succeeded in stealing 2 houses through fraudulent foreclosure proceedings. Elderly residents who thought they were facing legal foreclosure and signed over their properties to avoid losing everything. Detective Rodriguez explained that Karen had been using the same pattern everywhere. Target elderly residents living alone, create fake violations with massive penalties, threaten immediate foreclosure, and either collect large payments or trick victims into signing over their properties. The houses she's stolen are worth over $300,000 each. She's been flipping them through her shell company and keeping the profits. How did she get away with this for so long? Elder fraud is often unreported because victims are embarrassed or scared, and she was targeting people in different communities who weren't talking to each other. The evidence seized from Karen's house included bank records showing over $400,000 in fraudulent collections, fake legal documents and templates for creating violations, lists of elderly residents with notes about their vulnerability, real estate records for properties stolen through fraud, communications with accomplices helping execute the scheme. Karen was arrested the following Friday evening as she was leaving a community meeting where she had been trying to convince more residents to pay fake violations. I was there to witness it, along with about 30 other neighbors who had come to hear the results of the police investigation. When Detective Rodriguez and two other officers approached Karen in the community center parking lot, her reaction was immediate and explosive. "What is the meaning of this? I'm the HOA president. You cannot interrupt official community business." "Ma'am, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and elder abuse," Detective Rodriguez said, holding up the arrest warrant. "Fraud? Extortion? I haven't committed any crimes. I've been enforcing legitimate community financial obligations." "Ma'am, please put your hands behind your back." "I will not. This is harassment of elected community leadership." "I demand to see your supervisor." Detective Rodriguez tried to remain professional. "Ma'am, we have a valid arrest warrant. Please cooperate." "I don't recognize your authority to arrest community leaders during the performance of their official duties." Karen actually tried to run back into the community center, apparently thinking she could claim sanctuary. "This is persecution. This is a conspiracy by disgruntled residents who can't handle effective governance." The officers caught up with her at the entrance and attempted to handcuff her, but Karen continued struggling and screaming. "Get your hands off me. I am the duly elected president of this HOA. I have legal immunity for actions taken in my official capacity." "Ma'am, HOA presidents don't have legal immunity for criminal fraud." "Criminal fraud? I was protecting property values. I was enforcing community standards. These people," she gestured wildly at the neighbors watching, "don't understand modern community management." As they finally got the handcuffs on her, Karen's voice reached a fever pitch. "You're making a terrible mistake. When my attorneys prove that I was operating within my legal authority, all of you will face lawsuits for false arrest and harassment of community leadership." "Ma'am, threatening to foreclose on someone's house over $3 is not community leadership. It's criminal fraud." "It wasn't $3. It was $15,000 in accumulated penalties and fees. The $3 was ancient history." "Ma'am, you just admitted that you created $15,000 in fake penalties for a $3 assessment." "They weren't fake. They were legally calculated according to established penalty structures that I researched and implemented." Detective Rodriguez looked at me and shook her head in amazement. Karen was essentially confessing to fraud while insisting it was legal. "You people don't understand HOA law," Karen continued screaming as they led her toward the patrol car. "Community leaders have broad authority to enforce financial obligations and protect property values." "Ma'am, community leaders don't have authority to steal money from elderly residents." "I didn't steal anything. I collected legitimate fees from residents who violated community standards. Eleanor Patterson's unauthorized landscaping was a serious aesthetic violation. Robert Chen's air conditioning unit exceeded acceptable noise levels. Maria Santos's mailbox positioning violated setback requirements." The neighbors watching were stunned as Karen continued to justify her fraud scheme. "Every penny I collected was legitimate compensation for compliance monitoring and enforcement activities." "Ma'am, collecting $12,000 for planting roses is not legitimate anything. It's legitimate penalty assessment for unauthorized landscaping modifications." "Do you have any idea how much property values can decline when residents ignore aesthetic standards?" As they reached the patrol car, Karen made one final desperate attempt to assert her authority. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. I demand to contact my attorney. I demand recognition of my status as elected community leadership." "You can contact your attorney from jail, ma'am." "Jail? You're putting a community leader in jail for protecting property values? This is exactly what's wrong with law enforcement today. You people don't understand the complexities of modern community governance." Karen continued ranting even as they put her in the back of the patrol car. "This arrest will destroy community governance standards. When residents realize they can attack effective leadership without consequences, chaos will reign. Property values will collapse." Her voice was muffled but still audible through the car windows. "I was protecting this community from financial irresponsibility. I was implementing enforcement mechanisms that previous board members were too weak to use. Someone had to maintain standards." As the patrol car drove away, we could still hear Karen screaming about property values and community standards. The neighbors who had witnessed the arrest were shaken by the intensity of Karen's delusional ranting. "She really believes she was protecting the community," Mrs. Henderson said in amazement. "She really believes stealing from elderly residents was legitimate," Tom added. And she really believes she has some kind of special authority that makes fraud legal, I concluded. The scary part, Detective Rodriguez told us, is that she's probably going to maintain that delusion all the way through trial. People like this rarely admit they've done anything wrong. The charges against Karen were extensive: fraud, multiple felony counts, extortion, elder abuse, enhanced penalties, theft by deception, criminal impersonation, creating fake legal documents, real estate fraud, money laundering, through Desert Holdings, LLC. As Karen's case moved toward trial, the scope of her crimes became even clearer. Prosecutors from both state and federal jurisdictions were working together to ensure she faced maximum penalties. Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen explained the charges during a meeting with all the victims. Mrs. Stevenson is facing over 40 felony counts across state and federal jurisdictions. The total amount of money she's stolen exceeds $600,000, and she's directly responsible for the theft of 4 homes from elderly victims. What kind of sentence is she looking at? Eleanor asked. If convicted on all charges, she could face 25 to 30 years in prison, plus full restitution to all victims. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Bank records showing the flow of stolen money testimony from dozens of elderly victims, evidence of the fake legal documents and violations, real estate records proving she stole houses through fraud, digital evidence showing her network of accomplices. Karen's defense attorney tried to argue that she had been acting in good faith as an HOA president, and that the violations were legitimate. But the evidence against her was too clear and too extensive for any reasonable doubt. Karen's trial began in March and lasted for 3 weeks. The courthouse was packed every day with elderly residents who had been victimized by her schemes. The prosecution methodically presented evidence of Karen's systematic fraud. Day 1. Financial evidence showing how Karen had stolen over $600,000. Day 2. Testimony from elderly victims describing the fear and intimidation. Day 3. Real estate experts explaining how Karen had stolen houses through fraud. Day 4. Law enforcement officials detailing the scope of her criminal network. Day 5. Digital forensics showing her online fraud manuals and victim targeting. The most powerful testimony came from the elderly residents who had lost their life savings to Karen's schemes. Eleanor Patterson took the stand and described how Karen had terrorized her into paying $12,000 for planting roses. She made me feel like a criminal for putting flowers in my own yard. I was so scared of losing my home that I gave her my entire savings account. Robert Chen testified about losing $18,000 for air conditioning violations. I worked for 40 years as a teacher, saving every penny for retirement. She stole it all in one afternoon with fake legal papers and threats. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Margaret Foster, an 85-year-old woman from another community who had actually lost her house to Karen's fraud. She convinced me to sign over my house to avoid foreclosure over a $50 landscaping violation. I trusted her because she was the HOA president. Now I'm living with my daughter and will never get my home back. Karen's attorney, David Pierce, faced an impossible task trying to defend someone who had clearly committed extensive fraud against elderly victims. His strategy was to argue that Karen had been confused about her authority as HOA president and had genuinely believed she was enforcing legitimate regulations. But when Karen insisted on testifying in her own defense, she destroyed any possibility of sympathy from the jury. Mrs. Stevenson, did you create fake violations to collect money from elderly residents? The prosecutor asked. I did not create fake violations. I identified legitimate compliance issues and implemented appropriate penalty structures according to established community standards. Established by whom? By me, as the elected HOA president with full authority over community governance. So, you admit you made up the violations yourself? I implemented necessary regulations to protect property values and community standards. And you collected hundreds of thousands of dollars from elderly residents based on these made-up violations? I collected legitimate fees and penalties according to established procedures. Karen's testimony continued for 2 days, and she never showed any remorse or acknowledgement that her actions had been wrong. These people were violating community standards and threatening property values. Someone had to enforce proper compliance, even if it required difficult financial penalties. Mrs. Stevenson, You threatened to foreclose on an elderly man's house over $3. How is that protecting anything? $3 in violations can escalate to thousands of dollars in community damage if not addressed promptly. Effective governance requires strict enforcement. The jury was visibly disgusted by Karen's continued justification of stealing from elderly residents. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Karen guilty on all counts. 15 counts of fraud in the first degree, 8 counts of extortion, 12 counts of elder abuse, 4 counts of real estate fraud, 6 counts of money laundering, multiple federal charges for wire fraud and interstate fraud conspiracy. When the verdict was read, Karen's reaction was explosive. "This is a miscarriage of justice. I was protecting community property values. You people are destroying effective governance." The judge had to threaten her with contempt to get her to stop shouting. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later. Federal Judge Robert Martinez was clearly disgusted by the scope of Karen's crimes. "Mrs. Stevenson, you systematically targeted elderly residents in multiple communities, stealing their life savings through fear and intimidation. You stole their homes, their security, and their dignity. Your actions represent a profound betrayal of trust and basic human decency. This court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay full restitution of $847,000 to your victims. You are permanently barred from serving in any HOA capacity and from any position involving management of other people's money." Karen's final statement to the court was predictably delusional. "This sentence will destroy community governance. Standards nationwide. You're criminalizing effective leadership and property value protection."